Imagine walking into a room where every whisper of emotion, every hidden pocket of tension, and every masked insecurity is a physical weight pressing against your chest. For the first 30, 40, or even 50 years of an empath's life, existence is not a gift, it is an open wound. They are psychological sponges, absorbing the unexpressed rage of a spouse, the subtle deceit of a colleague, and the heavy anxiety of a crowded subway car. They are told they are too sensitive, too dramatic, or too soft. They are the natural prey for psychological predators who feed on their boundless supply of validation. But there is a dark, quiet secret about the empath personality that psychology rarely discusses. The very traits that make them vulnerable in the first half of life are the exact raw materials that forge them into the most formidable human beings on the planet in the second half. When an empath finally learns the art of boundaries, a massive tectonic shift occurs. The sponge becomes a radar, the victim becomes the observer. In this speech, we are going to dismantle the myth of the fragile empath. We will strip away the soft, modern-day spiritual wellness talk and look at this through the lens of cold, hard behavioral science, human influence, and autonomic mechanics. You are about to discover the precise moment the empath transitions from being a target to becoming the most powerful person in any room they enter. We will break down the neurobiological pivot that happens when high sensitivity meets decades of pattern recognition, and how a mature empath develops a form of influence so quiet and so absolute it can control a room without saying a single word. If you have spent your life feeling like your sensitivity was a curse, or if you have struggled to understand why the world's most manipulative people always seem to find you, pay very close attention. We are not talking about healing, we are talking about weaponized self-mastery. By the end of this, you will not only understand the exact behavioral mechanics of the mature empath's hidden power, but you will also possess the operational framework to step into that power yourself. The prey is about to become the profiler. Let's begin. Most people navigate the world with a psychological shield. They see a face, they hear a voice, and they process the surface-level data. An empath doesn't have that luxury. When an empath walks into a room, their nervous system is wide open. They are registering the microscopic tightening of a jaw, the tiny pitch shifts in a coworker's voice, the heavy, unexpressed grief of a stranger sitting 3 feet away. It is an overwhelming barrage of human data. For decades, this feels like a design flaw. It is exhausting. It leads to isolation, boundary collapse, and chronic burnout. But here is what no one told you. You weren't broken. You were just an uncalibrated instrument. You were a master-level behavioral decoder running on a child's operating system. But as the years pass, something incredible happens. The operating system upgrades. The sensitivity remains, but the vulnerability evaporates. This is the story of how the softest target in the room becomes the most powerful authority in it. In the first half of life, the empath is a sponge. When someone near them is anxious, the empath's own heart rate spikes. They absorb the poison, mistake it for their own, and try to fix it. But around midlife, the empath suffers what we call absorptive fatigue. They simply run out of space to hold other people's emotional trash. And in that exhaustion, they make a radical, unconscious shift. They stop absorbing and they start observing. This is the pivot point. The empath begins to put a thin sheet of glass between their nervous system and the world. The incoming data doesn't stop. The micro-expressions, the vocal shifts, the body language cues. But instead of letting that data flood their emotional core, they let it land on the glass. Suddenly, they aren't feeling your anxiety anymore. They are reading it. They have spent 40 years accumulating the most advanced database of human behavior on Earth. Because they felt everything so deeply, they know exactly what fear looks like before it becomes a word. They know what deceit feels like before a lie is fully formed. Once they disconnect the absorption trigger, they instantly possess an elite, near supernatural ability to profile anyone in real time. Manipulators, narcissists, and dominant personalities rely heavily on a psychological tool called projection. They construct a false narrative, a projection of dominance, or innocence, or victimhood, and they force the room to agree to it. Young empaths are highly susceptible to this. Because they hate conflict and desperately want peace, they will absorb the projection, play the assigned role, and twist themselves into knots trying to make the manipulator happy. But a mature empath? They have survived the gauntlet. They have met every version of the manipulator, and they have memorized the playbook. When a manipulator tries to throw a projection onto a mature empath, it doesn't stick. The empath looks right through the projection and sees the raw, trembling insecurity underneath. They don't argue, they don't defend themselves, they just look. And in that quiet, unblinking gaze, the manipulator realizes their tricks don't work anymore. The mature empath has become immune. And there is nothing more terrifying to a psychological bully than a person who can see through their armor and refuses to play their game. Human beings are wired for resonance. Our nervous systems constantly communicate with one another beneath our conscious awareness. When someone enters a room in a state of high stress, the entire room subtly tightens. The mature empath utilizes this neurobiological feedback loop to command space. Because they have spent decades managing a highly sensitive nervous system, they have had to master the art of self-regulation. When a mature empath decides to be calm, they are not just acting calm. Their heart rate drops, their breathing deepens, and their autonomic nervous system enters a state of absolute grounded control. This is not the loud, fragile authority of a person shouting for attention. This is autonomic authority. It is the quiet power of a person who is so entirely comfortable in their own skin and so deeply regulated that the room has no choice but to settle down and listen to them. They control the temperature of the room simply by existing in it. Sensitivity was never your weakness. It was your training ground. You spent the first half of your life being crushed by a gift you didn't know how to use. You felt too much, you cared too much, and you let people take too much. But those days are over. The decades of feeling, watching, and surviving have turned you into a master of human nature. You have the database, you have the boundaries, you have the quiet, unshakable calm of a person who has walked through the fire and come out stellar. And to the world that thinks it can continue to take advantage of your soft heart, let them try. They have no idea that the gentle person sitting across from them is actually the most powerful behavioral force in the room. The training is complete. Step into your power. To understand the power of a mature empath, we must first dissect the raw, chaotic mechanics of their youth. In the early stages of life, the empath possesses what is essentially a highly advanced military-grade sensory suite running on a completely uncalibrated operating system. From a strictly behavioral and biological standpoint, their nervous system is hyper-reactive. While the average person walking through a room registers only the macro behaviors, a smile, a handshake, a loud laugh, the young empath is unconsciously scanning at a microscopic level. They are detecting the subtle, rapid micro-expressions that flash across a face for a fraction of a second, revealing the true emotion behind a forced grin. They register the minuscule pitch variations in a voice that signal hidden aggression, deceit, or fear. They see the tiny adjustments in body posture, the shallowing of breath, the dilation of pupils, and the autonomic flushing of skin in those around them. The critical failure in youth is not the sensitivity itself, it is the total absence of a cognitive filter. Without a mature psychological operating system, The young brain does not know how to compartmentalize or categorize this massive incoming data stream. It does not look at a colleague's micro expression of contempt and think subject A is projecting their own insecurity due to an external stressor. They lack the psychological triage system required to sort threat from noise. Instead, because the empath's boundaries are entirely porous, that raw behavioral data bypasses the intellect and floods straight into their own nervous system. The empath absorbs the data as raw emotion. They feel the coworker's contempt, the spouse's unexpressed resentment, or the stranger's panic as if it were their own. They are a walking, breathing emotional lightning rod, constantly grounding the negative energy of everyone else in the room without even realizing what they are doing. This constant, unregulated absorption of environmental stress has severe physiological consequences. The young empath's autonomic nervous system is kept in a perpetual state of high alert. Their adrenal glands are constantly overtaxed, and their sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight mechanism, is constantly firing because their brain is registering the hidden tension and hostility of the people surrounding them as active, immediate threats. This leads directly to systemic fatigue. They suffer from unexplained physical exhaustion, chronic brain fog, and a deep, soul-crushing burnout that sleep cannot cure. They subconsciously attempt to fix the emotions of others, trying to soothe the anxious and placate the angry, not out of altruism, but as a basic, desperate survival mechanism to make the agonizing external feedback loop stop. They have no emotional armor, no protective barriers, and absolutely no concept of psychological boundaries. They are entirely at the mercy of whatever emotional storm happens to be passing through the room, making them highly susceptible to manipulation and exploitation by predatory personality types who recognize this vulnerability and use it to drain their resources, leaving the young empath completely depleted, isolated, and utterly defenseless against the psychological weight of a world they are forced to feel but cannot yet understand. The catalyst for this profound transformation is a state of absolute psychological and physiological crisis known as absorptive fatigue. There comes a point in the empath's life, typically in their midlife years, where the human system simply cannot sustain the constant, unmitigated influx of external emotional toxicity. The biological cost of carrying other people's unresolved trauma, hidden anger, and manipulative intent becomes too high to pay. The adrenals are spent, the nervous system is frayed, and the psyche faces a stark, binary choice: adapt or collapse. It is in this crucible of exhaustion that the brain executes a brilliant, involuntary defensive maneuver. It constructs what can only be described as a cognitive firewall. This firewall does not block the incoming behavioral data. Rather, it fundamentally changes the destination of that data. The empath begins the hard, calculated transition from absorption to observation, decoupled from emotional resonance. To understand this shift, we must look at the neural mechanics of how the empath processes human behavior. Previously, when the empath detected a micro-expression of hostility or a subtle shift in vocal frequency, their mirror neurons would fire in absolute symmetry with the target, forcing the empath to actually experience the hostility. During the pivot, the prefrontal cortex intervenes, establishing a critical gap between stimulus and response. The incoming behavioral cues are no longer allowed to penetrate the limbic system. Instead, they land on this newly formed psychological pane of glass. The empath still registers the exact same micro-expressions, the same structural shifts in body language, and the same autonomic tells of the people around them. But the emotional payload is entirely neutralized. The data remains just that, objective, clinical data. This is the precise moment the empath ceases to be a victim of their environment and instead becomes the ultimate behavioral profiler. Once the emotional feedback loop is broken, the vast, unstructured database of human behavior that the empath spent decades collecting is suddenly unlocked and weaponized. Because they have spent their entire lives feeling the precise physical and emotional reality of every psychological state, they possess an intuitive, hyper-detailed map of the human subconscious. They know exactly what fear feels like, what deceit looks like, and what desperation looks like underneath the mask of confidence. When they look at a room now, they are not feeling the room's anxiety. They are reading it with the cold, analytical precision of a computer screen. They can pinpoint the exact moment a negotiator's confidence falters by a subtle 2-degree shift in their shoulders. The power dynamic in every interaction they have is instantly and permanently reversed. The mature empath no longer enters a room wondering if they will survive the emotional atmosphere. They enter the room to analyze, decode, and master it. They sit in silence, completely unbothered, while others attempt to posture, manipulate, or lie. Because they are no longer reacting emotionally, their presence becomes a massive, silent vacuum that forces others to reveal their true motives. The target has officially become the observer, holding an invisible mirror up to everyone they encounter, reading the deepest, most guarded secrets of the human mind without ever letting anyone see behind their own glass. To fully comprehend the lethal efficiency of the mature empath, we must analyze the total collapse of the manipulator's psychological arsenal. In the arena of human influence, predatory personality types, specifically high conflict personalities, narcissists, and Machiavellians, rely almost exclusively on the deployment of false projections. They construct highly calculated, artificial psychological realities and project them onto their targets. They project an illusion of absolute authority, an illusion of moral superiority, or a highly weaponized illusion of victimhood designed to trigger guilt and compliance. When dealing with an uncalibrated younger empath, these projections are highly effective. The young empath, driven by a desperate need for harmony and lacking cognitive boundaries, willingly steps into the projection, absorbing the blame, accepting the false reality, and altering their behavior to placate the manipulator's fragile ego. However, as the empath transitions into maturity, they develop a profound systemic immunity to these psychological illusions. This immunity is not born of anger or bitterness. It is the direct result of clinical exposure and rigorous pattern recognition over decades of survival. The mature empath has encountered the manipulator's playbook hundreds of times. They know every play, every detour, and every linguistic trap. When a manipulator attempts to throw a projection onto a mature empath, the empath's cognitive firewall instantly identifies the maneuver. The projection fails to stick because the empath no longer seeks the manipulator's validation. Without the hook of seeking approval, the projection simply slides off the glass boundary. The empath doesn't react, defend themselves, or engage in the argument. This creates an immediate, highly disruptive power asymmetry. When a manipulator encounters a mature empath, they expect a specific behavioral feedback loop: defensiveness, anger, compliance, or emotional distress. Instead, they are met with a cold, unblinking, and entirely neutral psychological observation. The mature empath looks directly through the fabricated persona, analyzing the micro-expressions of panic, the subtle vocal tremors of overcompensation, and the desperate body language of a person whose survival mechanism is failing them in real time. The empath sees the small, frightened child behind the monstrous mask. In behavioral profiling, we know that nothing is more terrifying to a psychological predator than a target who cannot be manipulated, who does not react, and who can see their deepest, most guarded weaknesses with absolute clarity. By refusing to absorb or validate the false reality, the mature empath effectively starves the manipulator of their psychological oxygen. The manipulator's projections shatter upon impact with the empath's quiet, impenetrable boundaries. The empath does not need to raise their voice, issue threats, or engage in intellectual combat. They simply stand in the absolute truth of what they are observing. The true pinnacle of the mature empath's dominance lies within the hidden mechanics of human biology, specifically a phenomenon known as autonomic authority. Human beings like to believe they operate entirely on logic and conscious intent. But beneath the surface of language and rational thought, our nervous systems are locked in a continuous, subconscious dialogue. Through microscopic shifts in muscle tone, the expansion and contraction of pupils, the subtle warmth or coolness of skin temperature, and the invisible frequencies of vocal production, our bodies are constantly broadcasting our internal physiological state to everyone around us. In behavioral science, this is closely tied to the concept of limbic resonance, the capacity for empathetic nonverbal connection that all humans possess. When a person who is anxious, angry, or desperate walks into a room, their chaotic high beta brainwave state and elevated sympathetic nervous system activity create a subtle but distinct ripple effect, forcing the nervous systems of those nearby to unconsciously tighten and mirror that stress. For the first half of their life, the uncalibrated empath is the victim of this biological feedback loop. Their highly sensitive nervous system is easily hijacked by the chaotic vibrations of others. However, through decades of enduring this intense sensory onslaught, the mature empath is forced to develop an elite level of physiological self-regulation. They have had to learn how to actively cool their own nervous system while standing in the center of a psychological firestorm. When a mature empath enters an environment of high tension, crisis, or conflict, they do not merely pretend to be calm. They don't throw up a fake smile or use a soft voice while their heart is racing. Instead, they execute a deliberate internal command over their own physiology. This creates a massive, undeniable power asymmetry in any room they enter. Because human nervous systems naturally seek equilibrium, the most stable, deeply regulated nervous system in any given environment will inevitably become the dominant anchor. This is the exact mechanism of autonomic authority. When the mature empath enters a chaotic situation holding this dense, heavy state of internal calm, the erratic, high-stress nervous systems of the people around them begin to subconsciously entrain to the empath's frequency. Without a single word being spoken, the room begins to settle. The screaming argument loses its momentum, the frantic negotiator slows their speech, and the hidden manipulator feels an overwhelming, inexplicable pressure to drop their guard. This form of quiet influence is entirely distinct from the loud, aggressive dominance typically displayed by traditional authority figures. Narcissists and dominant personalities attempt to control a room through theatrical displays of power, aggressive body language, or verbal intimidation. But that loud dominance is incredibly fragile. It is an active expenditure of energy that betrays an underlying desperation to control the outcome. The mature empath's authority is absolute because it is entirely passive. They do not demand submission. They simply embody a state of physiological invulnerability that makes submission the only comfortable choice for the chaotic minds around them. They possess the rare and lethal ability to alter the psychological climate of an entire room simply by sitting in it, exercising a sovereign, invisible command over the human element through the sheer, irresistible weight of their own self-mastery. When we analyze the culmination of this lifelong psychological evolution, we find that the mature empath has transformed into the ultimate human decoder. In the field of high-stakes behavioral profiling, we understand that human beings are constantly leaking their true motives, their deepest insecurities, and their hidden agendas. They leak this data through micro-expressions, vocal pitch variances, spatial behavior, and nonverbal baseline shifts. The average person, and even many trained investigators, must consciously strain to catch these fleeting cues. They must run through checklists in their minds, intellectually analyzing body language. But for the mature empath, this decoding process is entirely fluid, intuitive, and lightning fast. By combining this deep, lifelong database of human emotion with their newly established cognitive boundaries, the mature empath operates with surgical precision. They sit in meetings, negotiations, or personal confrontations with a dual-layer perspective. On one layer, they see the superficial mask that the person is actively presenting to the world, the words they are saying, the confident posture they are holding, and the logical arguments they are making. On the second, far more powerful layer, the empath is reading the subconscious undercurrents. They observe the microscopic hesitation before a key word is spoken, the subtle vocal strain that indicates a shift from truth to fabrication, and the autonomic flushing of the skin that betrays a sudden surge of internal panic. Because the empath is no longer absorbing this data or reacting to it emotionally, they can analyze these leaks with cold, clinical objectivity. They are able to map out a person's psychological baseline and identify their core motivators, their deepest fears, and their precise vulnerabilities within minutes of interaction. This makes the mature empath incredibly effective at navigating complex human dynamics and influencing outcomes. They know exactly which emotional levers to pull and which verbal triggers to avoid, not to manipulate maliciously, but to guide interactions to a specific, calculated resolution. In any competitive, professional, or interpersonal arena, this level of insight is a devastating advantage. Traditional tacticians rely on leverage, power plays, and overt pressure to achieve their goals. But these methods always invite resistance and retaliation. The mature empath, however, operates entirely in the shadows of the human subconscious. They do not need to push, threaten, or demand. They simply adjust their own behavior to match the invisible frequencies of the person across from them, guiding the target's thoughts and decisions with such subtle, gentle precision that the target believes the outcome was entirely their own idea. The highly sensitive child, who once felt completely powerless against the world, has become the absolute master of the human equation.